Hi, I'm Sterling Edwards. Let's spend a few minutes doing a little free art lesson here. Quite often we get involved in all the technical aspects of painting a picture and we forget the fun aspect of it. I'm going to show you how to do a piece a day, which is a snow scene. It's going to be a little simple landscape. It's on a quarter sheet piece of Fabriano Artistico 300-pound cold pressed paper. Now, of course, if you're doing a snow scene, the white paper is your snow. All we're going to do is paint a sky and a few trees and put a few shadows in. These are very effective paintings for a variety of reasons. One, they teach you how to do a graded wash, starting with a darker sky at the top and working lighter as we go down. They also show you different brush techniques for getting effects such as doing distant trees, doing foreground trees, painting shadows, loosening edges. The list goes on and on. There will be so much in this little exercise that I think you'll find enjoyable. And if you'll do this a few times, you'll be surprised how fast you're going to learn all these little attributes of making a painting work. Everything from aerial perspective, trees that are very far in the distance are very gray and light, as though there's lots of atmosphere between us and that tree. Trees in the foreground, of course, are much darker and larger because there's less atmosphere, so the colors come out richer. So let's start just with a real simple little sketch. And I'm going to in fact, let's not even start with a sketch. Let's just start by wetting the paper. Let's just have some fun with this. I'm going to wet from here up and make this all sky and leave this dry from here down. That's going to be my snow. So let's just go ahead and wet this. Now the colors I'm using are Lukas Watercolors. They're a beautiful paint, very, very, very bright, very vivid paints. And I've enjoyed using them. I'm having a lot of fun experimenting with them, and I think you'll find them very, very satisfying to work with. So the important thing right now is to just keep nice, wet washes of color, and we'll eventually come back in with some darker washes as time goes on. So the sky is pretty wet. We've wet from here up, which is all going to be sky. And I'm using this, this is a 2-inch brush of design, the Sterling Edwards blending and glazing brush. I'm using this brush to wet the sky because it holds a lot of water. I can go back and just scrub that in like crazy. You can actually hear, if you're doing this, you can hear the brush pushing the water into the paper as opposed to just skimming the surface like a soft brush. So this gives me a lot of tensile strength. Now let's come over to the palette and let's mix a very, very loose, watery mix of turquoise blue. Now this is the Lukas turquoise blue. It's a very, very beautiful, clean blue. And I'm mixing quite a lot of it. I want a nice reservoir of water and paint. A little bit darker maybe. And we're going to start at the top of this painting and start working down. Now this brush holds a great deal of water, so I shouldn't have to go back to my palette. I should be able to just, in one application from the palette, go back and forth and put the sky in. So let's see how it works. Starting at the top. And let's do one more, a little bit darker. I'd like to have a dollar for every time I've done a sky that took an hour. And now I've learned if I have the right brush and the right tools and the right technique, I can do it in 2 minutes. What a blessing that is. Let's try it again. Starting at the top, a little darker. And as we get closer to the horizon, of course, there's less and less paint in the brush. It starts to give you a nice graded wash. Now some of these lines, as the piece starts to dry, will vanish because the paper's wet, the paint will distribute evenly across the paper. So that gives me a nice sky, and of course I've got the snow. Now let's put in a few background trees. Background trees, of course, are going to be much grayer because they're in the distance. And I think for these I'm going to use, let's try a little bit of violet and a little bit of the turquoise blue. Since they are in the distance, we're trying to make them a little bit gray. And I also want a little bit less water in the paint, because I want these shapes to retain their identity without getting quite so solvent on that sky. Let's try this and see how it works. Now these are going to be little trees that are way off in the distance. They could stand to be a little bit darker. Let's put just a little bit more color. This tool I have right here is simply toilet tissue with a paper towel wrapped around it. It's a great blotter for getting the excess water out of my brush. A lot of times if you have a wet sky or wet paper like I have here, you don't want to put a really wet brush into it because you'll start getting a lot of blossoms and backgrounds. Now this is more what I'm looking for. Now we're getting a little bit thicker. So we're just putting a few background trees. They're pretty, these are violet, a little bit turquoise blue. And of course you notice right here where the paint is darker, makes the snow look much whiter. That's the key. We're looking for values. Values are lights and darks. because the darker I can make the shapes in the painting, the whiter the snow is going to look. And this is the one thing I see a lot of artists really fall short on, and when they work on a piece, they will stop at that value right there and call that a dark. I want you to watch as we take this one step further and use that as a mid-tone and then put some really rich darks in front of it and watch this piece come alive. So that gives me a few background trees. Now let's work on some foreground trees. So once again, we're mixing up a nice rich paint. Only this time, we're going to be using, let's put some sepia in it and just a little bit of yellow. We're making this very, very dark and very rich because these trees are closer to us. So here we go. The paper's still pretty wet, so I can come in here now and just really lay in a series of trees. And I can make these as tall as I want. And I can take the brush and very lightly, since it's a bristle brush, it's got that stiff bristle, it's very easy to lay it on there and just kind of push it and pull it. Get some very neat little pine tree effects. Now I'm coming down here where the paper's dry. Let's put some extra value in there. Let's put a little bit darker color right up in here. And again, I'm doing this because the darker that is, the whiter the snow is going to look. And let's also put a tree out over here. This little demonstration, aside from being fun, it does teach me a lot about how to control the values in my paintings, how to get nice rich colors, how to do certain kinds of brush work, for example, taking that brush and painting these pine trees. And we'll also do some grassy shapes and some blending and putting some shadow in this painting before it's over. If you look at these foreground trees, it makes these other trees much further in the distance. And that's what they refer to in paintings as aerial perspective. So you see this a lot, and if you want to give a painting a lot of depth, really maximize, in fact exaggerate the aerial perspective. Push your things way back, use much lighter values. Don't be afraid of using lighter values in the background and coming in with some very rich darks in the foreground. This is one of the exercises that I teach people in my workshops, and they thoroughly love it because everybody goes home with a nice painting that really only took a few minutes to paint. I think I've reached that point in my life where I'm just not going to knock myself out over too much. If I can find an easier way to do something, I'm going to do it. And the way I teach and these brushes I design are designed really just to make life a little easier. There are a lot of good brushes out there. Any good stiff bristle brush works for this technique. So now we've got a nice row of trees in the foreground, trees in the background, which are beyond the horizon line almost. And of course you got that sky. Now the only thing this piece needs now is to have some shadows in the snow. The snow right now is just nothing but blank paper. Well, let's go in there and do something with that. Let's change that. And I've got a 1-inch flat nylon brush. It's got a very, very sharp edge on it. And I'm going to use this just to come in and cut a few edges. But I'm also going to have another one of these blending brushes that I'm going to use to blend. So I've got the brush clean, and I'm taking a Kleenex and squeezing most of the water out of it. That's so important. This is not a time to come in here with a very wet brush because you get a lot of blossoms and backruns. By squeezing the excess water out of this brush and by using this blotter of tissue, I can make sure this brush is barely damp, just damp enough that I can move the paint and not worry about the blossoms. So let's go back to the palette and let's mix a little of this pretty blue color we have here and see about putting in some shadows in the snow. So I'm just putting in a little ridge of snow. Now I'm going to come in from the top, work down, and kind of lose that top edge of that. And as I do that, I'm wiping this brush off. You see I picked up a lot of paint doing that. So it's important to always keep that brush wiped off after you do this. Let's put a little bit more right in here. And once again, let's come in very lightly. Just kind of lose that top edge. And I think I'll also take some of that same color and tone down the bottom edge a little bit. Now, I'm doing this because if I put a white mat around this painting, I don't want the painting and the mat just to look like one continuous shape. This gives me just a little color definition. And if I come in and kind of soften that edge, You see we start getting a very nice little snow scene. Now we can take this one step further and use a smaller brush. In this case, I've just got like a little number 3. Let's put a little tree in here. Let's just put a couple of suggestions, some smaller pines that are, maybe they've seen better days. And I'm doing this because the paper is almost dry up here. Now this gives me a good chance to use a different technique. I've got a lot of wet on wet. Now we're coming in with just a little bit of wet on dry, meaning wet paint on dry paper. We can put a few little details such as this. But the main thing is make it fun and make it interesting. Let's take it one step further. Let's put some grass. We've got this nice wet shape right here where it's got the kind of toning down the bottom edge of the paper. Let's take one of these brushes and put just a little tiny bit of yellow ochre and give me a nice little suggestion of grass. Let's take some yellow ochre and put just a little, maybe a little sepia with it. Make it just a little bit darker. And again, use this to get most of the excess water out of that brush. I can't stress that enough, that is so important. And I'm gonna lay the brush almost parallel to the paper and just, I'm not really pressing down, letting the weight of the brush almost just kind of rest against the paper and kind of very lightly pulling up. And I get these beautiful grassy shapes. I think a little more sepia might help. Let's make that show up a little bit better. Now you can do this as much as you want. The problem is it's too much fun and you'll have a tendency to overdo it. Put just a little bit in there. A little goes a long way. There's an old saying on watercolor that less is more, and I really do adhere to that principle. Because I have found if you put just a little suggestion of a shape, let the viewer use their imagination. They'll figure it out. They'll fill in the blanks. But this also helps give the piece more depth, and because it's a darker value, it makes the snow look whiter. So now we've got 2 or 3 layers of snow. We've got the foreground with the grasses. We've got the pine trees, which are somewhat in the foreground. You go across a little ridge, you can see by the shadow, and you go out towards the distant horizon. We've got a few trees that are barely visible, way back in the mist or the fog, or they're just back on the horizon line. And of course, you got that nice, clean application of the sky. It's a very simple piece, but there's a lot of technique goes into this. Each one of these techniques, if you will take a piece of paper and just practice doing the grass, practice doing the trees on wet paper, practice doing the graded wash, you know, give yourself a little fighting chance with this by doing a few exercises first, and then try this simple scene. Now I'm gonna do one more thing to this, and then we're gonna call this a finished piece. I'm gonna take some more, back to my palette again, I'm taking some more of this turquoise blue, a little bit of the sepia, and I'm mixing up another really dark mix that I use for the trees. Let's just put one more tree right here. Now this paper is dry now, so this little tree is gonna be much darker. So I'm just taking the brush and determining how I want that tree to look, how high I want it to be. And the reason I'm doing this is because these were all done on wet paper. You got these nice soft edges. Now to come back on top of that and put a foreground tree that has some hard edges, gives the painting so much more strength. Shows a different variety of technique. So I'm just popping a few little darks in a couple places, just to make the painting a little stronger. That's all it needs. It's a very simple piece, but I guarantee it's a great learning tool. If you'll try this, I'm sure you'll enjoy it. If you have a chance, look at my website, sterlingedwards.com. I have a lot of examples of paintings, everything from abstracts to representational abstracts to impressionistic, you name it, they're all on there. And most of these are done using these techniques, you know, the dry brush, the wet on wet, the wet on dry. It gives you a good variety of the different ways you can use these techniques to do something very creative and have fun with it. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this.